Thank you. And in the 10 minutes we have left, we'll talk about marijuana. If it's okay, I'm not going to use the mic up there because I can't sit still for a long period of time. I am mic'd up, but it's not going to amplify. It's only so that they can record every single agonizing word that I say. So I want to give you some background because you heard that I'm on the governor's marijuana work group. And here's how the conversation went, and here's what I can say and what I can't say tonight, especially knowing that I'm mic'd up and there's a bunch of cameras in the back of the room. So they called and said, would you be willing to do this? And I said, yes, but understand one thing. I think this is a terrible idea, right? And they said, well, the question is, do you want to be a part of the conversation? Do you want to be able to influence the conversation, particularly around the issues that you care about? And my answer was yes. At the same time, I also said, if you invite me in the room and I never get my way on anything, I have to come back to Long Island and answer to folks as to why I didn't get my way on anything. So if we're going to do this, it has to be a fair and open conversation. So we had that conversation, and then I signed a non-disclosure agreement. And so there's a whole bunch of things that I can't say about our internal process. But here's what I can talk about. There are several places in this debate where folks who are concerned about this issue can have an impact. Everyone is saying this is a done deal. It's not a done deal. And even if it were, I'm convinced that New York will do legalization in some way, shape, or form. There are several important questions that can make a huge difference in terms of our kids, in terms of the warnings we give pregnant women, in terms of driving while impaired, in terms of where the dollars go, and in terms of how we manage a process that gives communities like this community enough local control. I would predict that the governor's budget, and he said that it likely will, that will be released within the next 2 weeks or so, will contain the broad parameters for marijuana legalization here in New York State. It will contain broad parameters with a lot left up to the legislative process, right? The Senate and Assembly have to take a look at this and make some decisions about this, so it needs to go through that process, which is where the question of local control really becomes critical, right? Because you elected the folks who represent you here, and those folks ought to use their voices in Albany and beyond on this issue. And then it needs to go through a regulatory process. So there are questions around what are the criminal penalties if you have more than an ounce? What are the criminal penalties if you have more than 4 ounces? Do we allow folks who are growers to also be wholesalers? Do we allow wholesalers to also be retailers? How do we track the plant from seed to sale? Where is it grown? Under what conditions? There are probably 150 big ticket decision points that need to be worked out as part of this process. The other $1 million question is who at a state level actually manages the process, and where do the dollars come to build the infrastructure to do this in a way that reduces the potential harm in communities? That's going to take some money. So I'll say at the outset, and we'll talk about it in greater detail, almost everybody who has this conversation thinks about the dollar signs. We've even talked a little bit about what the potential tax revenues will be. We haven't talked about what it will cost to set up the program. We haven't talked about how if we're going to do this as a state, we can't wait for the tax revenues to roll in to educate our young people about the potential downsides associated with marijuana use, and there are several. And we haven't taken a look at this state's alcohol tax and really gotten a grasp on the fact that for every dollar we collect here in New York State in alcohol taxes, we spend $7 cleaning up the mess associated with alcohol use, right? Car crashes, medical costs, lost productivity, kids that wind up in the child welfare system. There's a cost to doing all of this, and very often those costs get buried in very, very large Medicaid budgets. And we know historically, right, and a lot of us are making the pitch now to say if you're going to do this, we need to set aside adequate resources for those folks who would develop a problem as a result of using marijuana, and those numbers are pretty significant. But we know here in New York State that very often the promise of dollars to deal with new initiatives doesn't always materialize, right? The expansion, dramatic expansion of lottery and gaming systems was supposed to fully fund our schools. We perhaps were going to see a tax reduction. How many of you seen a reduction in your property taxes in the past 10 years? right? It hasn't materialized. A lot of us said that if you're going to put Jake's 58 down on the expressway, you ought to make sure that there's a commensurate increase in compulsive gambling programs. That didn't happen. And so when we talk about marijuana legalization and the possibility that we'll take some of those revenues and set them aside for young people who need treatment, for prevention education programs, and for family-based services, there's a lot of us that have said, I've heard this story before, and we need to make sure that the money is invested up front. If you have questions as I go through this, I'm going to talk for maybe an hour, then we're going to open it up to questions. But if there's something you simply can't hold on to and must blurt out at any given time, feel free to do that. We'll roll with it. But I have here a presentation that usually runs about 3 hours. You're welcome. We're going to do this in an hour, maybe even a little bit less. But I want to give you some of the high points as we do this. The national landscape is that virtually every state is looking at or doing legalization. That's having a huge impact on what New York State does. So as New York State looks at the fact that in October, with a lot of fanfare, Canada legalized pot, that Vermont, which has a very different program than we're looking at, legalized pot, that New Jersey has been looking at it. New Jersey is a real important case for this community because New Jersey was supposed to legalize marijuana by the end of 2018. It didn't happen. It didn't happen for one reason. It didn't happen because enough municipalities said, we're not doing it and we're opting out. That's what made the difference. That's why this still hasn't happened in New Jersey. But as states began to do this, neighboring states take a look at it and say, do we want to be the only ones not doing it and have people leave our state to go into another state, buy their marijuana, and we get none of the tax benefits and all of the bad stuff that goes along with an increase in marijuana use? Same thing that happened with gambling. Right? We expanded gambling opportunities here in New York State because Connecticut had it, because New Jersey had it, because all the states around us were doing it, and people were jumping on the ferry and driving down the Belt Parkway to casinos and spending money elsewhere. So as other states do it, there's a synergy that happens along with this. Most states now have a medical program, and I was involved in the creation of New York State's medical program as well. I will tell you that the medical program that we originally envisioned, which did not include smoked marijuana in any way, shape, or form, because you don't smoke medicine, quite frankly, has expanded in a way that some of us are a little bit uncomfortable with. That's not to say that there aren't some conditions for which marijuana can be helpful in terms of alleviating the symptoms, but selling marijuana as a cure for cancer and other things is just plain irresponsible. I also have mixed feelings about using marijuana for vets with PTSD and for folks with mental health issues. There's a big part of me that says we ought to do better for our vets than saying go smoke a joint and forget about what you experienced. And so there are some conditions where it gets harder for us to establish that there's a medical need. But I will say New York State has done a reasonably good job of restricting and controlling the medical program. Some would say too good of a job. If you try to go on the medical marijuana program right now, and insurance by and large does not cover it, it's going to cost you about $750 a month. Right? Really expensive. Somebody's making a whole lot of money in doing this, which means that if you have a chronic medical condition for which you're going to use marijuana, the odds are you're not working at this point in time. And then somebody taps you on the shoulder and says, medical grade marijuana, pharmaceutical grade marijuana, or smoked marijuana on the street, what are you going to do? Right? The cost differential is huge. So we're seeing a huge amount of folks that actually go to street pot as opposed to medical pot, use smoked product, which has some significant health consequences, particularly around your lungs, oral cancers, and those kinds of things. We also know that the level of contamination in street pot is really significant and can aggravate some of the conditions for which it's commonly used, namely MS and some other conditions. But most states have either done a medical program or legalized completely. This is what the map looks like. You only see a couple states that have done nothing around marijuana. Almost everybody's done a medical program. In some of those states that have a medical program, they've required that those be high CBD, low THC preparations. THC is the stuff generally that gets you high. CBD is the stuff that you now see marketed all over the place with absolutely no regulation, is promoted as a cure to everything under the sun. My hope is that at some point in time the FDA steps in. It's not that CBD is going to get anyone to crash a car, but I see more and more it being marketed very aggressively as a cure for a whole bunch of things without FDA approval. On the issue of FDA approval, really important to understand that in this country for the past 40 years, Every medication available on the market has gone through an FDA approval procedure that includes folks that have science degrees. Marijuana is the only substance that has not gone through that process and procedure, and it's been left up to politicians. With all due respect to our elected officials, very few are physicians, very few are researchers, and there's one drug that we've carved out to deal with differently. That's not necessarily good for consumers, and it's not necessarily good for making sure that they have the information that they need. Really important to know, this remains illegal at a federal level, right? I don't have a lot of sympathy for our folks in Washington these days, but as long as it remains illegal at a federal level, that causes some problems, right? It causes problems around banking. In fact, I said to the state director of taxation and finance, how will people pay their taxes when they open pot stores if this remains federally illegal and Chase, for example, won't handle pot money? Are they going to come to you with a wheelbarrow full of nickels? Right? And so we don't yet have a way to deal with the banking aspect of this, although there has been the development of several closed-loop systems that are not FDIC insured, and folks have been willing to step up and do this. There's also a pretty significant disconnect between federal policy, specifically around schools, and what happens with marijuana stores. There's a whole history here that I won't go through this, but under the Obama administration, they basically said, look, the federal law is the federal law, we're not going to change it, but we're also not going to enforce it either. The Trump administration has been a little bit more vocal in saying we will go ahead and enforce it. Sessions did a major memo, I guess about a year ago, which basically said states are on their own. If we decide to change our mind and come marching in, you're going to have a problem. And the reality is to unravel what's happened in a place like Colorado or in Washington would be really, really significant, and quite frankly, have a pretty significant impact on businesses that are currently operating there. And so the disruption of a financial system is a real thing when it comes to this. My guess is that that lawmakers at a federal level probably deschedule marijuana and begin to move in the direction of allowing states to do what they want to do on this. But here are the tensions. There's a lot of discussion about whether or not marijuana in some forms has some medical properties, right? When we talk about this, it gets really tricky because for a long time, people like me have spent their lives discouraging young people from using marijuana. We know that there's a whole host of negative consequences for some kids that come with smoking weed, right? And now we've gone from a place where, as we discuss relative risk, we know that as the perceived risk associated with the drug decreases, the use does what? Increases. We've now gone from a place of saying perhaps marijuana isn't as dangerous as perhaps we thought it was to marijuana is actually good for you. And there are young people walking around saying, isn't this medicine? It's not. For some people with some chronic conditions, it can help alleviate symptoms. So would a bottle of vodka. But for some young people, this has very, very significant consequences. The other place is, as we've allowed medical marijuana, some schools have wound up in situations where they have drug-free zones, yet you have people using medical marijuana. Tension between local law, state law, and federal law. Whole bunch of stuff around the Fair Labor Standards Act. In fact, there's a major movement when it comes to organized labor in California and Colorado to say the Fair Labor Standards Act doesn't apply because these are folks who are involved in illegal activities. And so how do you begin to ensure that they're adequately paid the minimum wage? How do you ensure fairness in the workplace? These are some of the things that as you get into the weeds, you begin to realize the federal tension is not just should the federal government allow states to do what they want to do. There's actually concrete places where the disconnect between federal and state law has a significant impact. There's also a question of bankruptcy protections and the tax deductibility of those business activities. So one of the reasons, and I'll tell you in the past year, I've learned more about the marijuana business than I actually wanted to. One of the challenges and one of the reasons the price of legalized pot is so high is because there's a court case that goes back several years in which a very enterprising drug dealer tried to deduct his expenses of doing business, his cost of doing business, on his federal income taxes. So he said, scales, glassines, whatever it takes for me to do my business should be deducted. If you want me to pay taxes, I'll pay taxes. But the expenses should be deducted out. And the court, it actually went to several levels of appeal. The court said, no, you can't do that. You're involved in illegal activities. That still applies today. So if you open a marijuana store, guess what? According to federal law and your federal taxes, you cannot deduct the cost of doing business, which means that where does that get passed on to? It gets passed on to the consumer. I'm one of those folks who believe that folks should generally not smoke marijuana and that the price should be as high as we could make it and the taxes should be as high as we can make them. I feel the same way about cigarettes. The problem with that is if you make the price too high, guess what? There's a guy around the corner willing to sell you street pot. Some states have toyed around with the taxation level. So in Seattle, they used a 47% tax rate. It was too high. The black market persisted. There were other states, Colorado out of the gate, that made the tax level too low. And so you had a dramatic increase in use. Nobody has found that sweet spot. And one of the things I've suggested to New York is if you want to come up with a tax scheme, base the tax scheme on the THC levels in the product. Right? We know that there's a direct relationship between the THC levels, the addictive property of that drug, the likelihood that you're going to drive in an impaired way. Higher THC means a higher risk. Right? We have plenty of places in law and tax where if you're using a product that's more dangerous or has bigger consequences for the general public, you pay more. So here in New York State, my hope is that we come up with a plan that says if you want to use and sell high THC related marijuana, you ought to pay more to do that because it's going to take more for us to clean up the mess. The shift in public opinion is driven by one thing and one thing alone. Well, two things. All of us agree, including those of us who have been in the space for a long time, that the war on drugs has been an abject failure. For years, we have used the same mantras. For years, we have used the same approaches. Substance use has not gone down at all. And as someone who's knee-deep in the opioid crisis, I can tell you we have failed miserably. You heard a little bit about FCA. We run 2 licensed chemical dependency treatment centers, one in Hicksville, one in Hempstead. We run Long Island's only recovery center. We see it day in and day out. Our drug policies have not served us well, and particularly as it relates to marijuana, the consequences of being a young black male in New York City versus a white kid living just north of here, if you're caught with marijuana, are vastly different. We've spent a whole bunch of money locking up a whole lot of black and brown young men and pulling them away from their families as a means of trying to deal with marijuana use. It's worked terribly. That doesn't mean this is the answer, right? And so this is always what's put out as the justification. The war on drugs has failed, blah, blah, blah. That doesn't mean that we necessarily legalize, right? Some folks will say, can't we just decriminalize? So there's a couple different layers here, right? There's what we're doing now. There's decriminalization, where you basically make it a traffic ticket. It's worked to an extent, but it hasn't worked perfectly. We're still locking up a lot of kids. We're still saying empty your pockets, and the minute a dime bag falls out, we're locking them up and setting bail at $1,000. That's costing us a ton of money, quite frankly, and it's busting up families in a way that doesn't make sense. There's legalization. What Vermont did is they said you could grow up to 15 plants, you're on your own. If you sell it, you've got a problem, but if you want to grow 15 plants in your yard, that's fine. The next level is commercialization. Commercialization is where we invite an entire industry in and say, peddle your product. The state will get paid and everyone will be happy. Most states are doing commercialization because it's the only way you get tax revenues. But with commercialization comes some of the potential same mistakes we made with tobacco, with alcohol, and quite frankly with opioids. Right? We let an entire pharmaceutical industry run out there and say, this is the cure for pain. They're non-addictive, and they peddled the hell out of opioids. Then we found ourselves in a crisis, and now every municipality is suing the manufacturers, trying to recover some of the costs associated with their practices. There's a part of me that says we almost never learn. Right? We made some gains when it comes to driving while intoxicated. We're giving them back now. We've made some gains around smoking, right? The level of nicotine use, excluding vaping for a second, which is an important distinction, but of burned tobacco, combustible tobacco, has dropped precipitously. There too, we're giving back the gains with kids who are vaping. But it's almost like we don't learn. The other shift is, in New York State, the estimation, and there's a reason this is included in the budget bill, right? Part of that is political, part of that is strategic, but part of it is the state's going to project a whole bunch of revenues with this. The reality is, even if the state today signed on the dotted line and said, we're doing marijuana legalization. The first store probably wouldn't open until 2021 because there's so many things that need to happen. And so this might be in the 2019-2020 budget. It would be odd to see a budget that's balanced on the potential $200 million in revenues that New York State is looking at. But the fiscal piece is driving this in a really, really significant way. Please, one of the things that, and one of the areas where there are a whole bunch of folks that have pushed for legalization for a long time, and they tend to be the social justice groups. And there's a point in which we part ways. The point in which we come back and join together is, how does the question of social justice for minority populations and for disenfranchised communities sync up with allowing an industry to come in and make a whole bunch of money, right? We're talking MedMen, we're talking some of the other major companies. How do those two things connect, right? And the truth is, they probably don't in any way, shape, or form. In fact, in Colorado, there was a big social justice push around this. And in Colorado, immediately after the law passed, we actually saw an upswing in arrests for minority folks. Why? Because they were arrested for public use. One of the things we know about states that have legalized is that the Federal Clean Air Act still applies. So you can't, although I see it all the time, you're not supposed to be able to stand on a train platform and smoke pot. Right? It's a violation of the Clean Air Act. It happens all the time. But in legalization, the notion was, well, we'll legalize it, no one will get arrested anymore. More people were arrested, and they tended to be minorities, right? Not folks who are smoking in their finished basement at night, folks who are doing it out on the street. We've seen a pretty significant increase in support for marijuana legalization. I will tell you, and I've looked at a lot of the polling data, if you ask someone in the abstract, do you think we should legalize pot? Most people will say it's probably no worse than alcohol, right? And that's probably true, right? If you look purely from a health standpoint, alcohol takes more lives than any other drug, including opioids. So last year, alcohol killed 88,000 people. You heard when Jen did the intro that opioids killed 64,000. Alcohol still kills more people than any other drug. And if you said to me, is it better to drink like there's no tomorrow or smoke pot like no tomorrow, I would say you shouldn't be doing either, right? It's a little bit like saying, would you rather be bitten by a rattlesnake or a cobra, right? Both are bad. But we know that when it comes to alcohol, the health consequences are even more significant than when we talk about this. Our past president actually said that out loud, and when a president says it, people take it as gospel, no matter who that president is. And he said it's no worse than drinking alcohol. And in some regards, he's probably right from a scientific standpoint. When you talk like that to young people, they're left with the impression that what's the big deal? Mom and dad drink a glass of wine every night. Smoking pot is exactly the same. It's actually not. When you begin to operationalize some of this and say, all right, so if you think legalizing marijuana is a good idea, how do you feel about a pot store in your neighborhood? Guess what happens to the support? It all drops away. All right, people are like, generally as a concept, I think it's fine. But if you talk about putting it in my neighborhood 500 feet from my school, or next to my house of worship, or into a community that's already been ravaged by drugs and alcohol, the support begins to peel away. A lot of these studies, and not the ones that I've got up here, a lot of these studies are funded by the industry. And I've got some slides that'll kind of give you a sense as to the power of the industry, but some of this is industry generated. We've seen a pretty steady increase in the use of marijuana. In Colorado, for example, they consumed about twice what we thought the utilization would be in year one. So about 160 metric tons of marijuana was consumed in year one. To give you a sense, each ton is about 200,000 joints. And so that's a lot of pot. We know kind of that there's a number of people in Colorado, and right now the use is beginning to subside. In fact, in some states, they actually have too much pot now. They've overproduced. And we know that in a lot of cases, in the cases of adults, there's a lot of folks who, after legalization, went and tried it, got paranoid as all hell, brought back to their days as adolescents and said, oh, this is why I don't do this. Right? There's an initial novelty when you legalize things for people to go in and try it. Those aren't the folks that I worry about so much. I worry about our young people. And here's what we know about marijuana. And here's what we know about most drugs. For young people who postpone the use of marijuana, alcohol, and other drugs until the age of 21, they're far less likely to use substances or develop addiction over the course of their lifetimes. We know that for young people who use substances regularly before the age of 15, they're 5 times more likely than the kids sitting next to them to develop addiction during the course of their lifetimes. We know that between 10 and 20% of young people are predisposed, either because of genetics, circumstances, or some combination of those things, to become more easily addicted than the kids sitting next to them. 80% can probably smoke marijuana and the sky isn't going to fall. Not to say it's good for you, right? But they won't develop an addiction. 10 to 20% will, and those 10 to 20% are going to be the kids who say, it was the first time in my life that I didn't have anxiety. I didn't feel depressed. I felt like I fit in. I felt normal. For those kids that are feeling normal, imagine what it's going to take to wrestle that joint away from that kid, right? Isn't it what we all want, to feel normal? And so when a kid says it was the first time I felt normal, and guess what happens to that young person, right? Typically what happens is one joint becomes 2, becomes 3, becomes 4. Somebody taps you on the shoulder and says, hey, look, Vicodin is a much better drug. If you're feeling like you've got some pain, take some Vicodin, because there's a much larger profit margin in a $40 Vicodin than there is a dime bag of weed. And so the same kid who's selling weed to your kid is more than happy to sell them Vicodin. And as you use marijuana as a young person, what happens to your natural ability to moderate your moods and the way you're feeling? It never develops, right? We know that for women, brain development isn't complete until 21. The ladies in the room will understand that for men it takes infinitely longer. They tend to be 25. If you ask the women in my life, they'll tell you even at 52, there's still a lot of work to be done, right? And so when you introduce a substance like marijuana into the developing brain, it has a significant impact, right? And your body loses the natural ability to change your mood, to change your mind about things. You lose that chemical reactivity that typically is developing over that period of time. We also know that for a small percentage of kids that exists, those kids have a gene that predisposes them to mental illness. And we know that in some cases, marijuana lights up that gene for mental illness. And that's not to say that everybody who smokes a joint today is going to go crazy tomorrow, like you saw in Reefer Madness. It doesn't work that way. But there is a percentage of kids who have that gene, who are being exposed to marijuana without being adequately warned about the potential consequences in an environment where we're all saying, legalize it, what's the big deal? It's not the end of the world. I will tell you that I do probably 30 to 40 interventions per year. It is now common for me to hear young people say to a parent, but Dad, you smoke pot. Why am I the one going to treatment? And parents are actually smoking it with their kids in full view. Right? Important to also understand that the marijuana we're talking about today, vastly different than the marijuana 40 years ago. Right? Big business has entered the fray. This is not homegrown stuff that has a THC content of 2 or 3%. This is stuff that's really, really potent. Just some more stuff about relative risk. I want to go back to this. If you ask people, and they're not wrong, people believe marijuana is less risky than opioids. That's not saying a lot because opioids are incredibly dangerous. We've spent the past 10 years dealing with an opioid crisis. Here's the reasons why people don't use pot. So it's illegal, right? Is an important benchmark. In fact, I know a lot of people who would say, I don't particularly like pot. It's not something that kind of attracts me. But if it were legal, I might give it a try. The legal benchmark is really important in terms of the conversation. Why people use marijuana, again, to relax, pain relief. This number gets my attention because increasingly there's a discussion about using marijuana for pain relief. It's a really important conversation, and I would say it's one of those areas that when we look at the federal law and what the federal law has actually stopped, we need more research on whether or not it actually works. We need more research on whether or not it can provide assistance to kids with seizure disorders, and I believe the answer is yes. Right? We need to know more about, can it work on migraines? Can it work better than opioids on chronic pain? There's a whole bunch of conditions for which there might be a benefit. The federal illegality of this has stopped most of that research from happening, which leaves us all kind of wondering, so what's the potential impact, including those that have those conditions? This is just some stuff on perceived risk, nothing major or surprising in all this. There is some data here that talks about the perception of risk changing in Colorado, in Oregon, and Washington. Basically, the punchline in all this is that you see an increase in use, particularly among young people. We're talking, even the discussion here about legalizing marijuana has suggested that something has changed about the drug and that it's less dangerous. I will tell you, and we'll talk a little bit about impaired driving, but when I do school-based programs, young people tell me consistently, I would never drink and drive. You put the wrecked car out on the front lawn, I understand that I can crash into somebody, kill them, and my life will forever be changed. But most of those kids believe that they drive better when they're stoned. Not that they shouldn't do it, but that they are better drivers. And I say to them, why? I'm more chill. I don't react the same way, right? Understand that operating a motor vehicle, particularly for a young person, requires all of your senses, and it's one of the most complex tasks that we do all day, right? Marijuana and driving are a terrible combination. Here's some information on the marijuana industry, right? And so as we began to frame this as a social justice issue, really important to understand that there's a whole bunch of money behind this industry. $9 billion in sales in 2017. So when we talk about the social justice aspect, and as part of the governor's group, we did 18 listening sessions across the state. And there were folks there who said, look, I really need medical marijuana. I believe it would be of a benefit. It's too expensive. I want to see legalization happen for that reason, right? Really compelling, right? If somebody's sitting there in agonizing pain and they say, I don't want to take opioids, you convince me they're addictive. Medical pot costs $750 a month that I don't have, so I smoke street pot and it makes it all go away and I feel better. Really compelling to me, right? My entire life has been focused on helping people get out of their pain, whatever that pain might be in. This is not about that. In all of those sessions, I saw between 5 and 10 lobbyists for the industry working that room like there's no tomorrow. So as we talk about social justice and we talk about sick people, really important to understand that there's an economic driver of all of this. And those folks don't have to live in our communities as we try to clean up the mess associated with marijuana legalization. Whole bunch of pot stocks, both in Canada as well as here in the United States. The valuations are off the charts, so I included a couple companies here just so you can see the valuations. Market caps of $497 million, $492 million, $1.8 billion. These are major, major companies that are driving this conversation. And so while we believe it's folks that just want to smoke a joint at night, it's not. You even have major cigarette manufacturers getting into business. You have major alcohol manufacturers who are worried about their market share and whether or not people move from alcohol to marijuana. By the way, in Colorado, that was a big fight. It didn't work that way. People drank and smoked pot at the same time. Right? Really bad combination in which 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2, 1 + 1 = 5. And one of the things that I pushed really hard for here in New York State is that if you're going to sell or dispense marijuana, you cannot sell or dispense alcohol in the same place at the same time. And I will tell you that there are several wineries on the East End who are eyeing this and saying, even better than the wine business would be the pot business, right? And the returns are infinitely greater. And so you have folks looking to combine the winery experience with a marijuana experience. That's the kind of stuff that should concern us. A little bit more. Coca-Cola is taking a look at the legal marijuana industry. Altria makes Marlboro, is looking to reinvent the Marlboro Man in a whole different way when it comes to pot. These are the major brands that have entered this space or are looking to get into the space. Again, this is not about someone that says, I just want to smoke a joint at night. Can't you leave me alone? This is a big business proposition. If you look online and young people in a room, now you close your eyes and close your ears. Whole bunch of apps out there designed to help folks find weed. I will tell you, so if you're jotting down the app names and the website addresses in hopes of going there later, law enforcement spends half their life on these things. And so tons of apps now available so that folks can get information about marijuana, find dispensaries, that kind of thing. There's even an Uber for weed in Colorado where they will, and in California, where they'll actually deliver the weed to you, right? And there's a part of this that's a little bit amusing. There's a part of it that's a little funny. There's another part of it that says, what are we doing, right? And I've said to this state, There's many communities across Long Island that could use an economic development plan and some revitalization. I'm not sure this is what we actually need when it comes to economic revitalization. You have entire conferences focusing on the cannabis business, employment agencies that do nothing but do pot placements. So if you want to get a pot job, there are specific employment agencies that do nothing but this. There's actually probably 100 of them. I picked the ones with the best names and the best logos. The suppliers, some of you know that Scott's Miracle-Gro has diverted 40% of their business and moved it into grow supplies. They actually were based here on Long Island and have a lot of roots here to Long Island. They've moved away from the fertilizer business to focus on the marijuana business. I won't spend a lot of time on the New York State medical program. What I would say, and this is one of those inflection points, right? It's really important that the two programs are separate. Mixing the two can be damaging to patients that are struggling with major medical conditions. Here in the state, we've made a point of ensuring that those folks can access their meds. The program has been crafted very carefully. We currently have 2,000 registered practitioners, 83,000 current patients accessing the program. So when I hear about obstacles to access, that's really compelling to me. But 83,000 people are getting it. Right? And so it's not that only a small number of folks are accessing the program, a number of folks are accessing the program, typically under the guidelines of a practitioner. Also important to know, because it's federally illegal and not FDA approved, when physicians are writing recommendations for this, they're only writing recommendations, they're not writing prescriptions. Right? So you can't legally prescribe marijuana here in the state, you can only recommend it. There's some qualifying conditions. I told you a little bit how I feel about some of those qualifying conditions. I think there's a number of conditions on there that are no-brainers: end-stage HIV disease, Parkinson's, conditions like that, chronic pain in some regards. When we get to some of the psychological conditions that are a little bit harder to measure and harder to identify, I think that's where we need to have a more thorough conversation about how we use it. I won't spend a lot of time. Here's one of the things to focus on and to understand is the average potency of marijuana has risen steadily over the course of three decades. Obviously, as the THC content goes up, so does the potential impairment and so does the cost. Some stuff about driving, I'm going to skip through that. Here's an article bringing to life kind of what I said. Does smoking weed make you a better driver? Right? This is an open question. Are stoned drivers better drivers? Some say yes. When they do public polling and ask young people if you drive better when you're stoned, the majority of the time they say yes, absolutely I do. That's frightening. There's some IOM information on operating a motor vehicle. Here's the key takeaway when it comes to motor vehicles. The most complex thing we do, marijuana is an intoxicant. Law enforcement currently has no way, bless you, to measure someone's current level of impairment. We have 40 years worth of data that says you shouldn't drink any alcohol and operate a motor vehicle. 0 should be the amount, right? But we do know that 0.08 is the level in which it becomes illegal. And we've given people some guidelines as to how much you could drink over the course of an evening and remain unimpaired and below, not unimpaired, but below that 0.08 level, right? 40 years worth of data that says that's the level. Some of us believe that it should be lower, right? Rich agrees with you, right? We don't have that data when it comes to marijuana, and there's incredible variability when it comes to strains of marijuana. So with alcohol, we've figured out how to sync everything up in terms of a glass of wine equaling a shot, equaling a beer. Craft beers in some cases are the exception because they have typically a higher alcohol content. But we're also able to give you a breathalyzer, and we're able to ascertain that you're above that 0.08 level. When you test somebody for marijuana, marijuana can stay in your system for up to 30 days. We have no test, meaning law enforcement has no way to determine, are you currently impaired at this point in time? A test doesn't currently exist for that. We also have no way to guide consumers. So if you smoke a joint now, are you okay to drive in 1 hour, or 2 hours, or 3 hours, or 5 hours, or 10 hours, or not at all? We have no way to give them that information. Now, we also haven't done a great job of explaining what happens when you smoke even a little bit of pot and drink a little bit of alcohol. And so none of those public health messages have been developed. The technology doesn't currently exist, although some stuff is in the pipeline. And law enforcement has been very vocal in saying, we don't have the tools to police this in the right way. And this is potentially going to be a train wreck. Also an interesting fact of the state police, and I think some media outlet wrote about it recently, there are 7 police dogs in New York State that are imprinted only to find and root out marijuana. Those dogs are currently being retired. So when you think about all the things that have to happen with this and all the things you don't think about, it's huge. I'm going to jump through this. So Colorado, the good thing is we have a whole bunch of data coming out of Colorado, and we can kind of know what potentially will happen. You know, here in New York State, our attitude from the top on down is that we're the Empire State and we always do it better than anybody else, and we're smarter than Colorado, and we'll learn from them. We'll take some of those lessons and turn it into an overwhelmingly positive experience. And I like to think that we always do things better than, say, Colorado too. But there's some things that should get our attention. Car crashes have increased. The overall number has not dramatically increased. The number of serious car crashes has increased in a pretty significant way in terms of the number and frequency in which they're finding marijuana in a car crash victim system. Does that mean that marijuana caused the car crash? No, right? But it becomes really difficult to tease that out and say there's no relationship between an increase in marijuana use and fatal car crashes. And law enforcement in that state has said, yes, we think there's a connection. This one caught my eye, and so what they did is they sent a bunch of state undercover folks into pot shops, and I visited one of them that actually got jammed up for this. And they sent them in as pregnant women in their second trimester. And they told them, go in and say that you have morning sickness. And let's see what they recommend. In 80% of the cases, they recommended that woman smoke marijuana to make her morning sickness go away. That's terrible advice. Dispensed not by a doctor, but by a salesman in a pot store, right? This is the kind of stuff that we're trying to avoid here in New York State. ER visits for toddlers more than doubled in Colorado. Why? Because there's a big push for edibles in Colorado. And if you look at the edibles, and I saw them on display in a place that looked like the Apple Store, they're gummy bears, they're flavored sodas, they're stuff that comes in fluorescent packages. It's not stuff that's marketed towards me, right? It's stuff that's marketed towards young people. Toddlers walk around and see a gummy bear that's red and pink. What are they going to do? They're going to eat it, right? And edibles, the THC level in edibles is much more significant than you could ever get in a smoked preparation. And so we see more kids land in the ED. Treatment admissions among young people have increased exponentially. And in fact, up until the time New York State had its heroin crisis, the single largest reason for admissions of young people into the state treatment facilities was marijuana. Not any other drug, but marijuana. And I will say generally now, and I've probably dealt with 5,000 heroin users in the past 5 years, every single one of them will say, it started with alcohol and weed and progressed from there, right? That doesn't mean that every kid who drinks alcohol or smokes weed is going to move on to bigger and badder things, right? And we've got to stop using the phrase gateway drug, right? Because it makes it sound inevitable. And when we talk about kids moving on to other things, it makes it sound like, well, if you're just smoking pot, it's not a big deal unless you use heroin. It is a big deal. It has public health and personal health consequences for those young people. So we know that a certain percentage will go on to use other drugs. So we've seen a dramatic increase in Colorado around treatment admissions for young people. The interstate interdiction has been very, very significant. So it's not surprising that you see marijuana being FedExed and sent all over the country from a state that's legal. I mentioned the pregnancy piece. I went and visited a really state-of-the-art mental health and chemical dependency treatment center for young people in Colorado. Really nice model, would love to see it here. And I said to them, so did you guys get any of the tax money from marijuana sales to build this? Because it's beautiful. And they laughed. And I said, why are you laughing? And they're like, we just get the kids that are the fallout from legalization. We haven't gotten any of the revenues. We've had to privately fundraise to do this. We also know that the price of marijuana has dropped precipitously in Colorado. The total drop is more than $400 per pound. Right? And as the price drops, utilization tends to increase. So Colorado's not been a success story. You know, what I would say is there's a lot of folks who will say the world will stop spinning on its axis if New York legalizes. That's not going to happen, right? But there are some bad things that potentially happen to our kids, that potentially happen when it comes to pregnant women. We know that the rate of marijuana use among folks who suffer from mental illness is much higher than in the general population. Why? Because if you have anxiety and depression, marijuana makes it go away, if only for a short time. We know that the challenges around driving are significant, and there's a whole bunch of lawmakers, mostly from New York City, but not exclusively, who believe this is a great idea, who frame it as a social justice issue. They also don't rely on cars the same way we do here on Long Island. And so the night of the inauguration, I had dinner with Diane Savino. We tried to reconcile some of our differences. We were not successful. There's a pro-pot senator, and that's not a disparaging term, in the Senate. Her name is Diane Savino. She's actually from Staten Island. She's actually a lovely woman, but very, very aggressive about marijuana legalization. And I tried to explain to her, you know, the way this plays out in Nassau and Suffolk when you hear about road fatalities is much more significant than it would be in the 5 boroughs, where people aren't driving cars to the same extent. So the November elections certainly began to change things a little bit, and that there were more and more candidates on both sides of the aisle that were willing to talk about legalization. I would say, you know, there's a major change that's happening this week and next week in Albany. A lot of those folks are being lobbied heavily from both sides. I would say that the pro-pot folks, because they've got all this money behind them, are doing a much better job of getting to them than we are in the community. But this is a long process, right? And so let's assume that the governor does put this into his proposed budget. The legislature still needs to do its thing, right? And decide whether to approve, reject, say, we're going to actually carve this out of the budget because it's a bigger issue than that. Then it needs to go to a regulatory process. And so there's some big questions about, so who, right? Is it the state liquor authority that monitors this, right, which is already overtaxed and under-resourced? Or is there a separate state agency set up to deal with this? And if so, how does that happen? Does the medical marijuana program stay within the health department, which some of us believe firmly that it should, or does that move to a new state agency charged with regulating marijuana? A lot to be decided in this process. The good news is none of this can happen overnight. It's good news because it gives us a chance to do some of this work. You know, I will say that although I'm not supposed to talk about the process, there's a number of us around the table in the work group, and the work group was made up largely of state employees. There were 8 of us who are not state employees that were part of the work group process. Not a big number, and a lot of us had some concerns. Even those who were supportive of this raised concerns when it came to driving and access for kids. There's been some pretty spirited conversations, not in the work group, but in the larger community, about what the age of use should be. And there's some in our community who believe that age should be 18. I believe that it should be 25 based on the brain science that I told you about. We'll probably compromise at 21 is the reality. The one area that we have not spent a lot of time talking about is mental health, right? We have a state that did deinstitutionalization in a very aggressive way. Some would say did not put in the appropriate community-based support services, so we now see mentally ill folks in jails and prisons and homeless shelters and other expensive places where folks don't get appropriate treatment. It's easy to imagine a scenario where that dynamic is exacerbated by marijuana and the free trade of marijuana on the street. Some key decision points, right? I talked a little bit about regulatory authority. I talked about age of use. The market structure is really important, and so it's my belief that vertical integration of the industry would be a problem, right? That this has got to be separate. If you're a wholesaler, if you're a grower, you can't be a wholesaler. If you're a wholesaler, you shouldn't be a retailer, right? That the marketing's got to be very tightly controlled. So we've had a conversation about what does the marketing look like, right? If I had meant my way, there'd be a giant skull and crossbones on marijuana packaging. Right? The same way there should be on cigarettes and soda and alcohol, and I'm the buzzkill, sorry guys. But there ought to be warning labels. I've even gone so far as to say if stores are allowed to sell edibles, how come they're not going to be sold in child-proof containers, the same way we lock up opioids and make sure that people, including elderly folks, can't open them? But if this is going to be a reality, then there's got to be warning on the packaging. There should be a prohibition about making the packaging attractive to young people. Right? There ought to be lockable containers so that young people and toddlers can't get into them. Are they allowed to advertise on the Long Island Railroad billboards, for example? Right? These are things that need to be hashed out in terms of this state. What are the products that are available? Right? Smoked, edibles, how is that going to work? There's something that they do in Colorado to get around the taxation and the limits on selling, and that they will sell the bong, right, with pot for free that goes along with it, and that's the way they get around the taxation because bongs are not taxed at the same rate. And so will we have a prohibition in state law that says you can't do that? On-premise consumption, there's a whole bunch of folks that believe that's a great idea. I think it's a terrible idea. Right? So similar to bars, there would be smoking lounges or hookah lounges where you could go, and in some states you can do this, go and actually smoke pot and then leave and get in a car and drive away. I happen to believe that's a terrible idea. There is a mindset, though, that if you give people a safe place to consume, they're less likely to do it in a setting that's potentially damaging to their health. Not sure I buy it, and it's easy to imagine kind of the same way vape shops have popped up, these kind of lounges popping up all over. I live in Smithtown, and I will tell you that we went from having a really vibrant downtown to one that's now filled with massage parlors and vape shops, and that's it. We've had some discussion about the allocation of revenues, and so here's the way this potentially will work. The state is projecting probably $200 million in revenues in year one. We've had a spirited discussion about how that money is spent and where it goes. Some of us have said there's a certain number of folks that will get jammed up as a result of legalization, particularly young people, who will find themselves in trouble, who will find themselves with a diagnosable condition. Right now, the way we deal with marijuana is particularly at a time when, quite frankly, I have waiting lists for our treatment slots in Hicksville and Hempstead because I have lines out the door of folks that are struggling using 20 bags of heroin a day. If I've got a guy using 20 bags of heroin each and every day and injecting that heroin and holding up stores to do it, who do you think gets the treatment bed? Him or the 16-year-old that's smoking pot twice a week? He gets the bed. That doesn't mean that the 16-year-old who's smoking pot twice a week doesn't need treatment. And one of the things that we know is that the threshold to get into treatment from an insurance perspective is very, very high. There's no insurance company that will pay for treatment for a young person who's smoking pot a couple times a week. So what do? We wait until they get jammed up at school. We wait until they have a car crash. We wait until they progress to other drugs. Then we try to treat them. Missing a key. Imagine if we dealt with cancer that way. Right? The only time we're going to treat you is when you have visible tumors all over your body. Right? What would your cure rate be? 0. Right? And so we wait too long to get these young people into treatment. So some of us have made the argument that we need to create low threshold services, meaning psychoeducational services for young people who are smoking pot, right? It's not all that difficult to do, right? 10-week educational workshop, you get jammed up at school, 10-week educational workshop in which you promise somebody like me, you will not smoke pot for 10 weeks. I'm going to test you. You tell me you don't have a problem, you've just hung out with the wrong people. If you can't not smoke pot for 10 weeks and you test positive on a urine, guess what? You probably do have a problem, in which case you need to stay for 20 weeks instead of 10. Really not difficult to create. But that's what this state ought to be doing before we move ahead with this. And so waiting till the tax revenues roll in means that we've missed an opportunity. And if this state wants to do this, there ought to be at least $5 million set aside in the state budget now to start a PR campaign to educate folks about the downside of doing this. Our field, and I typically do this presentation for addiction specialists, has not done a good job of talking about the dangers of marijuana. We haven't articulated objectively why it's a problem to smoke pot. We haven't gotten into the brain development side of things. We haven't differentiated between the kid who's part of the 20% and the kid who's part of the 80%. Even for the kids who are part of that 80%, we know that impaired young people make lousy decisions, right? Young people generally, all due respect, sometimes make lousy decisions. Some adults do too, trust me, right? But our decisions get worse, right? Are you with me, adults? When we're impaired, right? Couple glasses of wine, you're drunk texting, we know where that goes, right? Add adolescence into the picture, and we know that when a young person is impaired, right, the risks for violence, the risk for criminal activity, the risk for unsafe sex, the risk for bullying, all the stuff we try to keep our kids safe from increase dramatically. We've got to change our message because we walk into schools, right? Tell me if I'm right. We walk into school saying, if your kid smokes pot, he's going to use heroin tomorrow. Going to be homeless and not have a job. Right? Our kids don't believe that because it's generally not true. right? And then they ask us as parents, didn't you smoke pot? And you avoid the question for 2 years, and then you finally get around to saying, well, yes. And our kids look at us and say, well, you turned out okay, right? And we never have a conversation about how the pot of today is vastly different than the pot of yesterday, right? That the legal consequences for use are vastly different, that the entree into other drugs, right? Opioids weren't even invented when most of us were smoking pot, right? That the game has changed dramatically. We don't do a good job because we're afraid to talk about our own substance use histories. We don't do a good job of really being honest with kids and saying, look, you're not necessarily going to go on to use heroin if you smoke a joint today, but let me explain to you why it's a terrible idea. And let me explain to you how by postponing use, maybe not forever, but for a period of time, right, because that's what we're talking about, reducing the risk, can reduce your risk for a whole bunch of things. So I talked a little bit about what we need to do. I promised you in an hour. We're about 4 minutes away from that, so we're pretty much on target. Here's some of the things that we've heard a lot about. Schools are really, really concerned about this in terms of how they manage this. So the state police are deathly afraid of this and are looking at this saying, we don't have the tools to deal with this. You all might want to do this, but we have no way of enforcing the law, and we have no way of detecting someone's level of impairment. The schools are saying to me, and probably to others, we already have an issue around vaping, right? And the perception is that vaping is fine, it's only water. Vaping is about nicotine. Vaping is about the tobacco industry regaining its foothold when it comes to our kids. Nicotine is one of the most addictive substances on the planet. It is toxic, right? Yet we're being told this is a way of scaling back your tobacco use. It's less harmful than combustible cigarettes. At the end of the day, is it less harmful than combustible cigarettes? Probably, but that doesn't mean that it's not without risk and danger, and it doesn't mean that the same rules for an 18-year-old apply to a 50-year-old guy, although they might. Right? And we know that most of the vape shops are supported solely by young people under the age of 21, which, by the way, is against the law. So schools will say, we already have a problem with vaping. We already have a problem with kids using THC products in vapes, and so they're undetectable. And how do we manage this? Workplaces that have safety-sensitive positions are looking at this saying, if it's no longer illegal and I can't test, right, and a person isn't visibly impaired as they would be with alcohol, and this guy drives a dump truck all day, or operates the Long Island Railroad train that we're all sitting in, how do we address that? That's not to say that these aren't addressable concerns. And again, when folks say, well, alcohol is legal, my response is, then maybe that's why we don't need another legal intoxicant, right? So you basically take an alcohol, you made it legal, what's done is done. Do you really want to add another legal intoxicant to the mix? And is that in New York's economic development plan? Some will say, well, it's also less harmful than opioids. Yes, and we're knee-deep in a crisis, right? And so I'm concerned as a drug treatment provider in that what happens to all the young people that do wind up with a problem? And I already have waiting lists, right? The state funding isn't adequate for me to treat everyone that has a heroin addiction. We're seeing a resurgence in cocaine and crack. And so the marijuana user potentially goes to the end of the line to the detriment of them and their families. There's an issue of restorative justice. I drew the distinction between legalization and commercialization, and they're two really, really different things. But the restorative justice piece of this is really important. And along the same lines as we're talking about commercialization, there's a really spirited conversation in which we, I think, align a little bit more closely to say, if we legalize now, what do we do about the tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of folks in New York State who are convicted of low-level marijuana offenses and can no longer get a job? Right? So for them, 3 years ago, it was illegal, it was against the law, you now have a low-level drug offense, you can't work and you can't support your family, so what do? You go back into dealing, right? And the kids arriving on the scene today can do this without any fear of prosecution. There's something inherently difficult with that. And so there is a discussion at a state level of, do we expunge their records? Do we allow folks that have been incarcerated out? How do we manage all of that? And if we're going to take a whole bunch of folks and let them out of jail, that has implications too, right? Mostly positive implications, but it does have implications and it's a change. There are some folks, and I don't buy into this, there are some folks who have said those who have been harmed by the policies of the past should be first online to get licenses to open stores, right? And there's a part of that ideologically that's actually a little bit attractive, right? And then common sense gets the better of you and says, but wait a minute, it was illegal, you broke the law, right? You shouldn't be forced online to get a business license to now sell it legally. The same way as if you had a major conviction and you wanted to open a liquor store, they'd say to you, I'm sorry, you don't have a clean record. You can't run a liquor store. So there are those kind of conversations going on. I would say the restorative justice piece is something that's compelling for a lot of us because we have seen lives that have been torn up by our approach to this and the policy. The question is, if we're going to do this, how do we put protections in place? How do we ensure that an industry doesn't have its way with our kids? How do we make sure that we're guarding against the downsides? I'm not sure that we can. If you ask me at the end of the day if we should do this, the answer is no. There's too many risks involved. We're talking about the health of our kids. We shouldn't be doing this, but if we're going to do it, then we need to make sure that we're doing something to address the potential harms. So I promised you an hour. As you could tell, I talk exceedingly fast, and so we packed a lot into that hour. That's where we stand. Comments or questions? Yes?
Let's say a driver of anything, of any vehicle, is drunk and they kill someone with their car. Obviously, that could become a big lawsuit. That person
Yes.
could lose everything they have. But if that same driver is impaired on marijuana and kills someone with their car, they can't. Nobody can prove that there was a drug that caused it.
So you would have to establish the connection between not only their use of their drug, but their level of impairment at the time, right? You need to know how impaired they actually were. Not that they smoked pot. I mean, if I smoked pot yesterday and drove a car today, I might be okay to drive a car, right? But I still have marijuana in my system. Marijuana stays in your system much longer than alcohol does. And there's no way to tell, all right, I smoked pot, how impaired was I? And was I at a level that impaired my ability to drive where I now have some criminal responsibility? No way to figure that out. So what I've said to prosecutors, go ahead.
It definitely doesn't favor the victims at all.
It doesn't. It doesn't. And it puts prosecutors in a really weird position of having to prosecute cases without a whole bunch of science and data behind it. Right? So the policy has to be, if you smoke any amount of marijuana within a short period of time, then you'd be prosecuted accordingly. I will say, here's the good news. There's two separate technologies being developed. One is actually pretty advanced. One is a cheek swab, which is able to detect how recently you smoked marijuana, which is kind of a surrogate for getting us to your level of impairment. But again, it's not perfect, right? If I smoked the crappiest pot in the world 3 hours ago versus the most potent pot 4 years ago, is there a difference in my impairment? There might be, I don't know. But as you could tell, as you heard from the rush of money into this, whoever develops the technology to determine someone's current level of impairment is going to make a whole bunch of money. And so there's a rush on. The other thing I wouldn't diminish is that we have in this state really good DREs, that is drug recognition experts, who are able to pinpoint pretty well someone's level of impairment based on field sobriety tests. And so I like technology more than I like the human observation because it takes a lot of the guesswork out of it. But we shouldn't diminish the fact that we do have the DREs that are out on the street that are able to, with a high degree of precision, determine whether or not you're impaired or not. Those folks are going to spend a lot of time testifying at trial. Rich.
Perspective of being out in the field, if an officer pulls over a person they suspect is impaired, especially on drugs, they need to call in a DRE.
Right.
And bring them in to do their evaluation. I believe Suffolk County has 12, and Nassau County
Sounds
I think
about right.
has 7. But it's something that, this year there are actually 3 classes instead of 1. So, but it's a very expensive process.
Right. Yes.
How do we support what you're doing with the governor? You go there as one person. How does he know that we're like the silent majority? How do we?
Yeah. So and it's the perfect question.
I just want to add, I've gone to so many of these, and so many people are saying, "What can we do? Who do we write to?"
Yeah, so I'll give you some really concrete things. And one of the frustrating things is we went to the listening sessions, and I'm a panel member, so I'm not supposed to say anything, but people generally know how I feel. That's why I'm on the group. I went to the listening sessions, and I'll tell you, it was like 90% in favor and only 10% against. And I'd go back to advocates and say, and in some cases we got it shifted. You know, there was one thing where I said to some of the advocates on our side, I'm like, you need to get up fast, right? Because News 12 leaves by 8:30, and so you need to get up and make your point because we need some anti-people kind of as part of the press story. So we coached them along, but it was basically 90% in favor, 10% opposed. And we were woefully underrepresented. And I asked people, why didn't you go? Like, it's a done deal. It's not a done deal. And even if it's going to happen, how it happens is really important. So there's been recently a pretty good press cycle kind of raining on the parade and saying this isn't all it's cut out to be. The experiences in other states aren't good, and I'm scared. You should be writing to your local papers. You should be writing to Newsday. You should be writing to the governor. You should be writing to your senator, to your assembly people. You should be encouraging and supporting your town who is doing exactly the right thing. The local opt-out in this is really important, right? So, and I believe that local opt-outs ought to be a part of this. I'm not sure it's going to be, but you guys should fight like hell to say, this is our community, right? Albany can make a whole bunch of decisions, but as a community, you should still be able to say no. And I will tell you that the word NIMBY is being bantered around when it comes to this conversation, and I've railed against that to say that's a really inappropriate application of the word. Right? And one of the things that we've said is that there are a lot of communities, you know, there's been a social justice argument made for this. And I do a lot of work in Hempstead. We have 3 locations in Hempstead. And there's a perception that minority communities want this. And there's a whole bunch of folks in some of those communities who are like, our community's been devastated by marijuana and other drugs. The last thing we want is a whole bunch of pot stores set up in Hempstead so that folks can drive north down Franklin Avenue, south down Franklin Avenue to buy their pot and head back up this way. And so there's a perception that there's universal support. So the more you guys can write letters, the more you could show up at public forums and say, wait, I think this is a terrible idea. The more young people can get involved, I think we can move the needle on this. There's a lot that's driving this, but I like to think that we're a pretty strong community and can fight back. So show up at public forums, educate your neighbors. Social media posts on this go a long way. And look, I'm fully aware that I've got a microphone on. The campaign moved some folks to the left on this, right? And if over the course of a year they were moved to the left, we have the ability to shift them right back using data and community input. And so that's what needs to happen here. We saw the shift. We need to see it shift back a little bit to a more measured approach.
Who are the biggest drivers? I mean, there's the big money, right? There's these
Yeah.
companies that are making this already, just waiting, right, for the legalization of recreational use. You've got social justice warriors, and I think there was a third group you might have mentioned. So if there's any one group that we should be viewing as our, you know, prime competition, like, who is that?
I'll speak to your question because you perhaps want to hear the other side a little bit, or maybe not. That there is a place, there's a place for education, in my opinion, and I'm sure you would agree with me that there is not a lot of education about cannabis in New York, and there is a lot of education about cannabis in other states where the legalization is happening. And saying that it's reefer madness kind of reborn or imagined is for the advertising campaign that you're looking to do, or saying that is not really giving what is potentially plant medicine its due. So I'm not disagreeing with you that
Yeah.
New York has a lot of work to do as they make this
Yes.
decision. And perhaps as people see cannabis right now, it's not for Port Washington, Manhasset, or these towns. But if we only put it in Hempstead or the places where people already have a different socioeconomic background than we do, then people are going to continue to see it as something that only can harm people. And I'm just here to invite you to think about the fact that it can help people.
So you said you'd answer her. So
Close. Okay, so I did a little research because I do go to all the meetings. I did really speak out about this. It was actually literally in my backyard. That was the proposed dispensary location. But that being said, I did some research about the laws in Massachusetts, and I was very concerned they actually prohibit local governments from limiting. And also, they do promote the current dispensaries for medical to have the first right to go into recreational sales.
Right.
So I really hope, since you're there, and I know you can't talk
Yeah.
about it, that scares the daylights out of me.
yes.
And I really hope that's not the direction that New York's going to
I don't like either of those provisions either. I'm not an elected official here in New York State. And so, and look, you know, what I failed to point out at the outset is you do have several elected officials who came here tonight to learn, so you shouldn't necessarily, you know, bird dog them on the way out. But they're here to learn and to hear the conversation. So I think that's a plus when you have elected officials kind of in the room here to listen and hear people out. I think that's really important. So thank you to all of you for coming tonight. We appreciate it. Good. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just want to say, I'm a physician, and, no, I see patients, you know, oncology patients, I'm a radiologist, I've had patients with migraine, and the same patient is also bipolar, and she said, you know, she got off of it, you know, for treatment of her migraine. But I have a son who I know since he was 6 years old was off kilter, always in trouble, you know, poor judgment, poor executive function, and then when he was 20, first year of college, diagnosed with schizophrenia. And he was using marijuana, I mean, not heavily, I'm sure, and drinking. That was what he had out of the dorm, NYU, you know, aced his SATs, you know, it's nothing to do with, you know, how smart you are and all that. But that's always been, you know, 1% of the population. But then you have bipolar. Now there's bipolar 1, bipolar 2. Bipolar 1, you're very creative, high functioning, you know, CEOs, you know, but you're labile, and you can get psychotic in bipolar 2. And a little thing like marijuana, that is, you know, proven to increase your dopamine, and that's the worst thing for people with psychosis, marijuana and bipolar disease, which is severe, you know, depression, I'm not sure about. That's more, you know, 9% of the population has some form of depression. But I'm going to say schizophrenia, no, it wasn't directly in our family. You don't know if it's in your family and if it's going to come out in your child because they don't know the genetics. There's tons of genes on both sides, mothers and fathers. And even identical twins, only 50% of identical twins, the other one will have, you know, the same schizophrenia. So you know, there's gene copies. They might have more, the one twin, more of the gene. So if this drug can potentially turn on that gene, you want to keep it away, and you don't know if you're going to have a child with this, and it's a severely debilitating disease. And I have personal, you know, and when your son or daughter doesn't, you know, they refuse the medication because of the side effects for 4 years, and they're roaming the streets, they're turning to alcohol, almost getting hit by cars, you know, and they'd be homeless without people like us who care about them. And so it's worth, I've written letters to the, you know, to state people, Elaine Phillips, to Judy Bosworth, and say printed it hasn't been printed in the papers, but do whatever you can on your computer, write it and send it in, and that's all you can do. And go to the rallies and stuff like this to educate yourself.
Cool.
Because our children, what's more important than that?
Thank you. Then I'm coming back to you.
I'm also a doctor, retired now, but the doctor population is probably a bad example of what can happen. I went to school class of 65, my MD, and I was bred with a fear of narcotics and their addictive potential. And then in the 90s, they came out with OxyContin, and the drug reps came around. And these financially motivated people put the pressure on the doctors. This stuff is not what they told you. That's nonsense. This is a sophisticated audience, you would think. They sold it. And at the same time, they changed the law to allow drug advertising direct to consumer on television. A generation of kids has now grown up watching television, seeing commercial after commercial after commercial, saying that if you have a problem, if something's bothering you, it's because you're not taking our pill.
Right.
And, you know, just take it and your problems will be solved. And one of my concerns with the marijuana, maybe going to come and maybe have a little bit of a say, is the fact that putting a marijuana store in the neighborhood down the street from a school would send entirely the wrong message. The kids are, not that they're going to walk in there and get sold pot, but they're going to see pot being sold. They're advertising drugs are good for you. All these smiling, happy people on the television commercials, despite all of the warnings that the voice tells you, these people are having a great time,
Right.
no matter what disease they're suffering from, because they have the good sense to take our pill. So these financially motivated people, heavily motivated people, are going to be pushing this stuff. I can tell you, but don't look to doctors to provide a solution. They don't teach you squat in medical school about prescribing. It depends on your good judgment and your good sense. You learn this stuff on the job, or you don't.
Right.
But we have a bad track record. As soon as the salesman came and said it's okay, hey, it's okay.
Right. And they still run commercials for opioids that suggest that opioid-induced constipation is the worst side effect associated with opioids, when in fact it's actually death and overdose. So we still see kind of.
Partly because I'm a doctor, I got drafted and sent to Vietnam, and I can tell you, by the way, that the Army, who has a vast experience in selecting young, impulsive, fearless people, say that the ideal infantry soldier is 19 years old, about brain development.
Right,
When they get to
right.
be 25, then you want me to do what?
Right.
But a
There's more
19-year-old,
regulation.
They're fearless. Hey, this stuff can't hurt me. And they need help. They need to be protected.
Absolutely.
Is there any state, by the way, I'm almost sorry that I came here, because you scared the hell out of me. I thought all we have to do is, I had simplistic thinking. Is there any state that is ahead of us?
No. And even if, initially the Vermont plan was really attractive to me because it didn't involve business, it involved people growing plants for personal use, which I have an easier time than like Altria and the major manufacturers entering the business. Even there, the amount of sharing and the amount of growth has been pretty significant, and there's no tax revenues to create the educational programs that everybody agrees that we need. And so even the complete legalization without the commercial aspect hasn't been all that successful. Vermont isn't around long enough to know for sure what the impact is, but some of the things that we all hope to prevent have not necessarily materialized, and they don't have the revenues to do the prevention programs.
Are you in good health?
As far as I know. Why?
Keep showing up in Albany.
I will. Thank you.
I just read an interesting article. I think it was the cover of the New York Times just the other day, and it was about this incredible surplus of marijuana in
Yeah.
2018 in California, and how because marijuana dispensaries charge so much more than the black market, that basically most consumers have gone underground to the
Yes.
black market. So the tax revenue has really suffered in California. And so the economic reality for the state is not at all what they had projected it to be. And I think that, I hope states like New York that are considering this are really looking at what's going on in other states as well.
I think they are. The issue of overproduction is significant, which I didn't anticipate coming into this. And there's a science to coming up with the optimal price point, right? What's the price point in which you create some barrier to entry, right? The same way there is with alcohol. But if you price it too high, you have people turning to street pot, which is typically contaminated, right? Even if it's not with external stuff, then you're talking about mold and fungus and spores. And the likelihood that someone's going to put themselves in a situation that is potentially dangerous in terms of buying and selling and trading and those kinds of things. So finding that optimal price point is not an easy balance.
But I think voters also need to know that it's not necessarily it's not going to be guaranteed to be as great as
Right.
as lawmakers are making it sound in
Right.
terms of revenue for their state. It
Right.
may not be.
Right.
And so I don't think that should be the only reason to legalize it, because
Agreed.
it may not turn out that way.
Right, and it probably won't based on the experience in other states. Other question? Okay.
Just a
So OMH is around the table, has been very vocal. OASIS is around the table. All the relevant state agencies are there. The state police are around the table. So it's a fairly inclusive group. And OASIS has had its say around the table.
I look for a good response from them.
Connected to that, and I've been involved in public education for somewhere around 15 years. Is public education around the table? Is School Boards Association, there's like thousands of public education groups. Are they?
Yeah, I think the only one that's around the table around ed is somebody from state ed. Keep in mind, there's only 8 of us that are not state employees. And so I think the rest of us are science types or public health types or addiction specialists. But like NYSED has not been consulted. I will say, generally, organized labor has looked at this as an opportunity. You know, I've had some conversations with Local 338 and John Derceau and some other folks, and generally, organized labor is looking to organize and mobilize a new workforce. But I think they probably share some of the concerns, particularly around educating kids and the challenges around safety-sensitive positions. That's where some of this begins to get a little bit frightening if you think about an increase in use. I said to somebody as we started, I don't really worry about the 50-year-old guy in his house at night that wants to smoke a joint as opposed to drinking a six-pack. I worry more about the 16-year-old kid that's feeling awkward and anxious and finds marijuana as a way of dealing with whatever, or the person who's smoking every night and then driving a dump truck the next day and things like that. I think that's where this begins to get really tricky. The other issue, and the doctor raised it, is that you have an industry out there that's promoting this and has its own skin in the game. And you need to make sure that you have an equal and opposing force so that that doesn't have negative consequences. And I'm not sure that we've built that up, and I'm not sure we learned our lesson with opioids or anything else. So if this were purely a social justice question, then I feel a little bit differently about it. But you have major industries now kind of coming in, and quite frankly, you know, the opioid manufacturers are laughing all the way to the bank while we try to clean up the mess and I deal with lines outside our treatment facilities.
By the way, great presentation.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you. Any parting thoughts, or are you moving closer to me because you want to wrap? Okay.
You never did answer my question.
What's your question again? Sorry.
The biggest drivers in the push to legalize recreational use?
Here's what I'll say, and it's present company excluded. Elected officials that want to ride the current of the day and think they'll be more popular if they support this, right? And then big businesses that have made a lot of contributions to elected officials.
Who are those businesses? What are they? Which ones?
MedMen is the biggest one, right? And so I would spend a lot of time. If you research online and say New York State marijuana, you'll find kind of the list of all the companies. But I think there's a role here to just for common sense to say, look, you know, nobody's worried about people who smoke in their homes, consenting adults that opt to do this instead of doing something else. What we're really worried about is access for kids, people with mental illness, vulnerable populations, pregnant women, the driving issue. I mean, there are certain key inflection points that I think are important. And then the question of what happens with the revenue, and does some of that revenue, if not all of it, get put back into. So let me say 2 things to you. The first thing I'd say is one of the things that worries me about this, and worries me about just talking about implementation, is that if we do this and it goes horribly wrong, there's no way to put the toothpaste back in the tube, right? So that's one of the things that worries me. On the issue of going from maybe we can stop this to the implementation issues, here's a parallel I would draw. I spend a lot of my time trying to convince heroin users not to use heroin anymore, right? And I can say to somebody, don't use heroin, don't use heroin, don't use heroin, you'll die, don't use heroin, right? And some of those folks are going to say, you're right, it's time to make a change, I'm going to get treatment. The rest will say, I'm probably not going to stop using heroin. In which case, right, so then I say to them, look, let me talk to you about ways to reduce the potential harm that you're doing to yourself and potentially to other people in terms of not sharing needles, using Narcan, those kinds of things. This is the same kind of thing. I believe that we should fight back and say, this is a terrible idea, right? Some of us have to say, this idea sucks, but if you're going to do it, here's the things you need to watch out for.
No, I totally agree with you. I mean, you need a seat at the table
Right.
to address those
Right.
kinds of issues, of course. I'm sort of getting at, you know, I'm just a layperson, right? I don't have a seat at the table. What can I do? And it's really good to know what the other side, who the other side is
Yeah.
specifically that you're fighting against, because it is, I'm sorry, I didn't call you an enemy, but it is your opponent, okay?
Yeah, look, I mean, look, let's not
I think it's big business. That's what
Yeah,
it
look,
is.
let's not demonize them, because I think demonizing doesn't ever help. I think it's a matter of finding the common ground, and then there are areas where we're going to diverge. Like I said, I've got social justice friends. This is the only thing that we disagree on, but we found a way to respectfully disagree, and I think we probably always will. The question is, where is there some common ground? And I think even folks that are pro-legalization will say, I don't want legalization for 16-year-olds. I don't want pregnant women miscarrying because somebody in a pot store told them to smoke pot. I don't want an increase in car crashes. And so I think, that's part of the conversation.
Just a quick question.
Yes.
Can marijuana set off a gene that can cause?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
There are triggers that, there's epigenetics that you have a gene, but you may never be turned on. And that's why outside influences, drugs, stress, can turn on. You might have a gene for diabetes you don't know about. But if you have a bad diet, it will turn on. It's not, and this is type 1 diabetes or type 2. You might, there's a lot of things.
Yes.
So I want my 13-year-old to join me this evening, and actually, I thought the content was going to be a little bit more focused on the impact of marijuana on the young brain.
Mhm.
I did touch on that a little bit.
Yeah.
But when I go home tonight, talk to my son, who's hopefully doing his homework because he's not here,
Fat chance.
what will be the main things that I should, because he's like, I already heard about that in Health, Mommy. I know, yeah, drugs are bad for you. He thinks he knows it all.
Yeah.
Right? What are the key points that I need to reiterate to him to kind of warn him? Because I feel like I wish it was the time, like the doctor described, where you grow up being
Right.
scared of
Taking aspirin.
narcotics.
Right.
That's how I grew
Right.
up. I grew up like, oh my God, I'm never going near that stuff. Like all through college, I was like, keep it away from me. Like, and maybe I was a nerd, but like, I was deathly afraid of drugs.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? And I wish that there was the fear of God in kids today about drugs, but as we can see, the message out there, and apparently the large percentage of people think
Is that there's no risk, right?
Yeah.
It's fine.
So
it's okay.
here's what I would say, and I want to make sure we leave some time in case our electeds want to kind of leave with a parting idea. There's a couple things. I think, although it worked for us to a certain extent, I think scaring kids generally isn't a very useful strategy.
Tobacco.
Right? But understanding the risk, right? So understanding there's a very real risk. Do you have, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but most of us have a history of addiction in our family. Do you have a history of addiction in your family? All right, so that's one kind of, what's that? That doesn't count. One of the things that we know is that there's a series of things that align to enhance your risk for addiction. We know that being a young person in and of itself, in terms of brain development, is a risk factor. We know that hanging around with kids that use substances dramatically increases the likelihood that you're going to use substances. Your kid might be someone who could, don't tell them this, but might be one of those kids who could smoke pot once and never do it again, in which case it wasn't a gateway, it was an exit drug, right? Your kid might be someone who says, for the first time, I felt at ease. I didn't feel any anxiety. It's really hard to stop once that starts, particularly if you're an adolescent. And one of the things that we show sometimes in slides is the amount of dopamine rush that you get from marijuana is roughly 600 times that if your kid went out and scored a touchdown at a football game, right? So you get that dopamine rush. There's no going back in a lot of cases from that. Over a period of time, you need a substance in order to get that same rush. Your body can no longer do it on its own, which is why you see folks at the age of 25 and 30 getting up in the morning and smoking pot before they do anything else, right? Not for everybody, but for a certain percentage of the population, that's what's going to happen. Aside from that, even for the kids who use episodically, I can't tell you how many kids will get effed up, right, as they call it, and do really life-changing things. The game has changed forever. They get in a car with somebody, they run across the road trying to cross the street. Something happens, and with kids, it happens really, really fast. So the question is, so why would you put yourself in that position? And one of the things you want to make sure in terms of dealing with your kid is that it's not preachy and that it's an ongoing conversation, right? The reality is your kid is going to be subjected to risk and temptation every single day of his life. It's not this, then it's sex or bullying or something else. You want to make sure you're keeping the lines of communication open the best you can. right? And if he's saying, I feel like trying it, I feel like, why? What's going on that you feel like trying it, right? And try to get to the core of the matter. So I hope that's a little bit helpful. And
Yeah.
Does it also affect brain development in the young?
it does. It has a significant impact. Again, the ability to modulate those dopamine levels disappear if you use an external substance to do that.
But I was under the impression that it also stunted the growth or the development of your frontal lobes.
In some kids it does, right? The other thing I'm really careful about, right, and I have a colleague that presents extensively on brain development. I've said to him a few times, you shouldn't leave young people with the belief that if they smoke pot, their brains are forever changed and they should just go ahead and keep smoking because it's a lost cause. So one of the things we know about the brain is that it heals really easily. Again, really important because it's a nuanced message. But I never want young people to believe, well, if you smoke pot, your brain is all screwed up, so there's no hope for you. So yes, you potentially change the brain chemistry. You potentially have a pretty significant impact. If you're one of that 10 to 20% that's hardwired or predisposed to a problem, it's harder to overcome that, but it's not impossible. What we see more typically is just the spiral, right? The constant smoking, the inability to study or focus without using a substance. The same applies to ADHD drugs as well. Right? Anytime you use an external substance to achieve those things, your body loses a natural ability. So yes, there's a change in brain chemistry. It's not permanent because the good thing about the young developing brain, in addition to it being dumb, is that it heals pretty quickly, right? Whereas ours probably would not as quickly. You see in high-functioning alcoholics who've been drinking for 30 years, brain changes that are probably not reversible. When you talk about a 14 to 16-year-old that smoked pot, the changes are probably reversible. So yes, but it's not permanent in most cases. Yes?
Is this on?
Yep.
So you said earlier in your presentation that for every $1 that goes towards from alcohol taxes, that 7 goes to cleaning up the mess. And I was
Yes.
really surprised by that. So how
Yes.
let's say that marijuana becomes legal in New York State, how do we learn from that and make sure that that the taxes not actually go towards helping out?
Now's the time. One of the things, and I mentioned it to folks at the beginning of the program, one of the things is you don't see the downside because those just become de facto Medicaid costs, right? So the number one cost driver in the counties, right, correct me if I'm wrong, is Medicaid, right? So indigent folks who go seek health care, that's typically where folks that use substances wind up. I spend my life getting people on Medicaid because their insurance companies discriminate against them. And so when you look at the Medicaid budget, they don't parse out what part of the Medicaid budget is related to drugs and alcohol, but it's there and it's a cost driver. If you look at the child welfare system, how many parents are losing their kids as a result of addiction? That doesn't mean, by the way, I don't want anyone to say or to believe that if parents are smoking pot, they should lose their children, right? We're not at that place. But the costs tend to get bundled into larger cost centers, and we never accurately tease out. We just look and say, well, here's the payoff. Right? I happen to live near the new casino out east, and I can tell you firsthand, when I walk around the community, I can see folks that have gambled away their life savings and are just hanging out now and really, really having a tough time. Right? Yet all we see in the paper is the revenues that went to OTB and the amount of money that it generated. We don't see the downside. So part of this is shining a light on the downsides and saying, oh great, if this happens, we brought in X amount of revenue, but we had 5 car crashes. Right, over the course of a month that cost the system this amount of money. Those are only the hard dollars. There's stuff that's a little bit harder to capture, right? If you think about the opioid crisis, think about the 600 families last year who lost their loved ones to overdoses. How do you put a dollar value on that? You don't, right? It doesn't mean that many people are going to die from marijuana use, but it does mean that there's a downside. And in any equation, any policy decision, you have to weigh, so what's the revenue versus what's the downside, and really capture what that downside is. Keep the conversation going, right? We've got to be able to say, yeah, it's potentially produced some revenues for New York State, but what did it cost us to produce those revenues? That's just good budgeting and good financial management.
So it's 9 o'clock. Thank you everyone for coming, especially our elected officials who had a very long day. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you all for coming. And let's keep talking.
Good, thank you.
Thank you.